Today, Sunday, 25th August, the news from Ukraine has been overshadowed by news of a massive Israeli airstrike on southern Lebanon. And when I say massive, that is no exaggeration. The scale of it appears to have been huge, involving up to 100 aircraft carrying out a series of massive attacks over the course of Sunday morning. The Israeli authorities are saying that this is an attack carried out in order to preempt a Hezbollah missile and rocket attack on Israel. And the way they present this attack is that it was principally targeting Hezbollah rocket and missile locations, which were being readied for a missile and rocket strike on Israel itself. And that might be true, because around the same time that this massive airstrike was underway, and in fact, possibly in the hours that followed, trying to get an exact timeline of what happened, I'm finding very difficult. But anyway, over the course of the hours, probably overlapping with the Israeli airstrike, but continuing after it, Hezbollah did indeed carry out a major rocket and missile attack on Israel, which they're saying they carried out in retaliation for the Israeli assassination of their commander, Fuad Shukr, who was killed on the same day, or roughly the same time, that Ismail Haniyeh, the political head of Hamas, was assassinated in Tehran. Now, that all seems fairly clear. The Israelis detected Hezbollah's preparations for a missile and rocket strike. They preempted it, perhaps successfully, because the Israelis are saying that most of the Hezbollah rockets and missiles that were launched weren't able to hit their targets, and that no significant damage was done in Israel. Only targets in northern Israel were hit, which were basically targets that the Israelis had already left vacant. So in effect, the Hezbollah missile and rocket strike, it could have been disorganized and thrown into some degree of confusion, and perhaps it was less effective as a result of this massive Israeli airstrike than it had been intended to be. Having said that, I have to say that there are some factors which do make me wonder. Briefly, if Hezbollah was indeed planning to conduct this kind of rocket and missile strike, then one wonders why exactly they were doing it on their own. We've been hearing over the last few weeks that there's been coordination between Hezbollah and Iran, that Iran, Hezbollah, various Shia militias in Iraq were all preparing for a simultaneous strike against Israel. But it seems that on this occasion, possibly, Hezbollah acted on its own. Could it be? Is it just possible that, contrary to my expectations, the Iranians have indeed pulled back from their own rocket and missile strike against Israel, and that Hezbollah became exasperated and decided to launch its own attack on its own, and Israeli intelligence got wind of the fact, and that was what led to this preemptive strike on Hezbollah. Now, that is not a possibility that should be discounted. Again, I don't know the full details and the full facts about what is going on in the Middle East. These Iranians, as I said, have been keeping us all waiting anxiously for what they intend to do. I've seen suggestions that there is going to be an Iranian attack on Israel, but it won't take place before October at the earliest, which is a suggestive date. Maybe The Iranians, however, have called off the entire idea of a missile and rocket strike. Maybe they've heeded the warnings from the Americans, and maybe they've also accepted advice to exercise restraint from their friends, the Russians and the Saudis. I have to say, my feelings are once again against this. And I think that more likely than not, this massive Israeli strike on Hezbollah positions, which seems to me to have been on an even bigger scale, on a much bigger scale, than what one would expect from a preemptive strike. That this Israeli strike, to my mind, appears to have had three purposes. The first, undoubtedly, is to degrade Hezbollah's ability to strike at Israel. And maybe there was a Hezbollah strike being prepared. Probably there was. And probably the Israelis did indeed want indeed to get their strike in first. Though I am sort of getting the sense that the Iranian strike might have been, the scale of it might have been exaggerated, possibly by both sides. Anyway, that's one rationale that the Israelis might have followed. The other is, I think, as a warning and perhaps as a preparation for the much bigger conflict that some people in the Israeli government are undoubtedly seeking, which is the major missile and airstrikes that Israel wants to carry out, or at least some officials within the Israeli government want to carry out against Iran. And that this was what this attack on the Hezbollah positions ultimately was all about. It was a warning to the Iranians and a threat to them. And possibly also, it was a softening up operation in advance of an Israeli attack on Hezbollah positions. I mean, a ground offensive on Hezbollah positions in southern Lebanon. There's been lots of discussion about this in the Israeli media for several months, and that the government of Prime Minister Netanyahu and many Israelis who have been forced to leave their homes in northern Israel because of the fear of Hezbollah rockets have been agitating for some kind of cross-border operation into southern Lebanon, and that this was intended in some way to prepare the ground for that. That is a second possibility, and in that case, it must be seen as preparatory to the larger conflict, the conflict that the Israelis are working towards, or at least some people are working towards, between Israel and Iran. And the third purpose of this strike might have been to convince people in Israel itself, specifically members of the Israeli Defense and Intelligence Forces, people who are known to be opposed to a regional war between Israel and Iran and its various allies in the Middle East, people who have been worrying that the situation of the Israeli Defense Forces after 10 months of grueling and inconclusive battle in Gaza is not really that strong, and who want a pause and who have been trying to push Prime Minister Netanyahu into agreeing to a ceasefire in Gaza that Prime Minister Netanyahu does not want. Now, I get the sense that the people who are advocating this approach are from Israel's ground forces, the army, in other words, and also from certain sections of Israel's intelligence community. Both Mossad, the intelligence arm of Israel, which conducts foreign intelligence, and Shin Bet, which is an internal security agency, Israel's premier internal security agency. And there are reports, by the way, that Shin Bet has recently written a letter to Prime Minister Netanyahu complaining about the actions of Israeli settlers on the West Bank, saying that these people are almost out of control, that they're becoming increasingly dangerous, and calling on the Prime Minister to bring these supporters back under control and to rein in the more radical elements within his government. So what Prime Minister Netanyahu and the hardliners around him might want to do is to demonstrate to these people that they are wrong, that Hezbollah is not really as strong as it appears to be, to launch this air attack on Hezbollah positions, demonstrate that the Israeli Air Force has complete mastery over the air in southern Lebanon, which indisputably is true, and say, well, you're worrying about a force, Hezbollah, that is actually something of a paper tiger. Events have moved on significantly since the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah in 2006. You're afraid of shadows. Let's therefore act against Hezbollah, and this massive Air Force raid on Hezbollah might have been intended to demonstrate this. I would point out that my guess is that the army, whilst the Israeli army and the intelligence services in Israel might indeed be exhausted and are apparently pressing hard Prime Minister Netanyahu to agree to a ceasefire in Gaza, I suspect that the Air Force and perhaps the Israeli Navy, but principally in this case, the Air Force, are in much better shape. They've not had to suffer the same kind of attrition that the army has. Their troops, their pilots are obviously not conscripts, and they might be much more willing to respond aggressively and to accept orders to act aggressively than some people in the ground forces are. That there are conflicts between the Israeli army and Prime Minister Netanyahu is indisputable. It appears, it's discussed extensively in the Israeli media. I believe that this letter from Shin Bet to Prime Minister Netanyahu actually was written and sent, and it's an interesting fact that it was leaked to the Israeli media. But then Israel is in some ways a very open society, and one learns lots of things in Israel. It's in some ways quite difficult to keep a secret there. So all of this may be playing out in Israel, and I can imagine that Prime Minister Netanyahu, who it's quite clear to me, is keen in some way to enlarge the war and does not want a ceasefire in Gaza under any circumstances, might be deciding that he needs to up the temperature, raise the temperature, and this massive missile strike on Hezbollah might have been what, might explain, might be the product rather of that kind of thinking. Now that, however, doesn't explain why Hezbollah appears to be playing along with this narrative, why they're going along with the narrative that there was a Hezbollah strike being prepared against Israel, and that it was indeed intended as retaliation for the assassination of Fuad Shukr, and why the Hezbollah authorities appear to be giving credence to the Israeli narrative, or at least to, if you prefer, to the narrative being promoted by Prime Minister Netanyahu. But there is one possible explanation, and it isn't an entirely far-fetched one, because Hezbollah are saying that having got their blow in, this missile and rocket attack, they are not interested in conducting further attacks on Israel at the moment. Now that might suggest that Hezbollah's intention at the present time is to prevent an immediate escalation, that neither Hezbollah nor Iran are ready, and therefore Hezbollah wants to say, well, yes, we did plan an attack on Israel. It was going to be a big attack. When the Israelis say that they preempted us, well, that's not entirely wrong. But we got our attack in. The Israeli preemption strike didn't prevent us. And in light of that, we have decided that we don't want to continue. We are going to stop. And of course, if your objective is to prevent further escalation by the Israelis, to prevent the Israelis conducting more missile and airstrikes, or indeed escalating the situation into an all-out war with Iran, if that is the objective at the moment of Hezbollah and their Iranian friends, well, one could start to see why that kind of approach might make some kind of sense. Anyway, we're told that Sheikh Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, is going to make a statement later today. Be very, very interesting to see what he says. Sometimes his words can be fairly ambiguous and require careful analysis and interpretation. I think until we hear from him, it's perhaps important, it's perhaps best not to try and overanalyze this event now. What I am going to finish by saying is this. Despite all of the claims that a ceasefire in Gaza is just around the corner, there is no sign of one. The Americans repeatedly say that they've almost finalized a ceasefire deal. The Israelis, Prime Minister Netanyahu, never quite agree and never quite deny, but whenever it looks as if an agreement is ready, Prime Minister Netanyahu comes up with more demands and Hamas rejects them. And this game has been played now for weeks and months, and I suspect that this is going to continue at least until the American election and beyond, or until there is a much bigger escalation, which is what I think Netanyahu basically wants. So there's been no ceasefire in Gaza, no real prospect of one. And my own view is that in a situation such as the one we see playing out at the moment, in which one party to the conflict, the Israeli government, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and his political allies, people like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, clearly want a wider war, we are inevitably going to see events like the ones that took place this morning. In other words, there's going to be more escalation, more acts of massive action by the Israelis, be they assassinations of people like Haniyeh in places like Tehran on the Iranian president's inauguration day, or massive airstrikes against Hezbollah in Lebanon. until Prime Minister Netanyahu and his officials finally provoke Iran and their allies, the Iranians and their allies, into that action which will lead to that war that Prime Minister Netanyahu is, in my opinion, absolutely clearly now set upon. So I think this is where we are. I think this is the ultimate explanation for the events of this morning, that this must be understood as part of a series of steps that the current Israeli government is taking in order to start that wider war. Now, of course, this is my own view, but I would argue that everything that has happened in the Middle East over the last few months really illustrates that. And I'm going to say that given that that is my view, I continue to believe that until Prime Minister Netanyahu gets his wall, we're going to see further big events like this one. We've had the attack on the Iranian embassy building, diplomatic buildings in Damascus. We've had the assassination of Haniyeh. We've had the assassination of Fuad Shukr. We've now had the massive bombing strike that took place today. We're going to have more events of this kind explained and rationalized in all sorts of different ways until, as I said, that big final war comes. And the only thing that could, in theory, prevent it is decisive action from the United States. But, of course, of that there is no sign whatsoever. Anyway, let's wait now and see what Sheikh Nasrallah has to say, what action, if any, Hezbollah intends to take, what the Iranians say about this as well. And, of course, the Israelis, no doubt, will have their own explanations, which we should wait for also. But to my mind, the war clouds over the Middle East continue to gather, and we are going to get continued flashes of lightning and thunder, which is what we got this morning, until the storm finally breaks. Anyway, let's now go to that other big crisis, the one in Ukraine. But before I do, can I say that it might surprise many people in the West to learn that the big story in Russia this morning is not the conflict in Ukraine or anything that's happening on the domestic political front. It is the arrest in France at Le Bourget airport of Pavel Durov, the founder of Telegram, who before that set up the Russian equivalent of Facebook, VKontakte, and who is, in other words, one of Russia's most celebrated and important tech entrepreneurs. Now, the Russian media has been covering the story of Durov's arrest with great interest, and I get the sense that an awful lot of people in Russia are very interested in this news as well. Now, it's important to say that Durov, though he continues to retain Russian citizenship, does not actually live in Russia. Some years ago, about 10 years ago, he got into conflict. He found himself in conflict with the Russian authorities over his insistence on keeping VKontakte, the, as I said, Russian equivalent of Facebook, fully independent and not sharing information about it with the Russian authorities. And, well, there were all sorts of claims and pressure from the Russian authorities, and eventually he sold VKontakte, which continues to function, by the way, and is a major part of the Russian social media landscape. Anyway, he then left Russia and he set up Telegram. And the Russian authorities were not pleased about that because they thought the Telegram was altogether too open, and they were concerned that Telegram might be accessible to political opponents and other opponents of the Russian government. And for a time, they tried to restrict the availability of Telegram in Russia, though not with any very great success. And as for Durov, sensing perhaps that he might soon be in legal difficulties with the Russian authorities and might be prosecuted, he left Russia and established himself in Dubai. And though, as I said, I believe he retained his Russian citizenship, he also apparently took out Emirati citizenship and has apparently French citizenship as well. Anyway, this leads on to the paradoxical situation, which has been touched on by people like Tucker Carlson, that Durov, who's had his tangles with the Russian authorities, has not been arrested and jailed or prosecuted directly by the Russian authorities. He's now been arrested by the French authorities, the authorities, in other words, of a Western country. And the Russian authorities, for their part, have now made rather sour comments about that themselves. The Russian Foreign Ministry, for example, is now asking the question out loud whether all of the NGOs and other agencies that in the West, humanitarian and human rights agencies in the West, that spoke up on behalf of Durov when the Russian authorities were coming after him, would now come after him, would now speak up for him, rather, when it is instead the French authorities who are coming after him, apparently on not entirely dissimilar grounds. Now, I say that I haven't yet seen any charges that have been brought against Durov in France, but there have been reports in the French media that the reason the French authorities are taking action against him is because he's refusing to apply proper controls on who can use Telegram, and the result is that all sorts of nefarious activities take place there, some of them of a strongly illegal nature. And I remember that the Russian authorities in their day said exactly, or seemed to me to be saying, essentially the same thing. So the Russians are making that point. Durov, by the way, tends to be someone who takes a very, very strong view about free expression. The Russian authorities, incidentally, found it impossible to restrict Telegram completely in Russia. Russians are, shall we say, a very, very tech-savvy people, and they were able to find all kinds of ways round the restrictions. And I believe it was in 2021 that the Russian authorities simply gave up. And it has been relatively straightforward to access Telegram in Russia ever since. Now, there is a twist to this, which is connected with the Ukraine war, because the soldiers on the various sides, both Russian and Ukrainian, and the various reporting centers, and, by the way, agencies of the Russian government, like the Russian Defense Ministry, they use Telegram as their favorite platform. And I want to stress this is people on both sides. So, of course, if, as a result of these legal proceedings in France, restrictions start to be imposed on Telegram, it's going to have a significant effect on the reporting of the war. Probably reporting agencies are going to have to transfer completely to perhaps Twitter X, or conceivably in Russia, well, in fact, unquestionably in Russia, to the many Russian social media channels, platforms that do now exist, but which are generally inaccessible to most people in the West. So this is an interesting story. It bears very, very careful watching. I'm not going to, as I said, prejudge this case until we have a clearer idea of what exactly it is that the French authorities are accusing Durov of. But, and this point has to be made, all of this is consistent with general attack that appears to be taking place across Europe on free speech rights. I've been seeing this in Britain. One sees this in all kinds of other places. And it looks as if the attack on Durov is the biggest and most open attack of this kind that has taken place so far. Anyway, that is the big news in Russia. It's also the big news. It's also very big news in Ukraine. As I said, there are many, many Ukrainian soldiers that use Telegram to express their views. Most military units on both sides use Telegram. These, brigades, they have their people who write their stories and their views on Telegram. All of the big military reporting channels, Ribar, Legitimi, Resident, they're all present on Telegram. If Telegram, as I said, is restricted, they will all be affected. Anyway, I'm not going to say more. Perhaps, as is my way, I've given a rather cold-blooded view of the Durov affair. I am concerned, actually, very concerned about what is happening and about what is happening in other places, including in Britain. But as is my way, I want to see what the actual case against him, against Durov, is first, before I start making more public comments. This has always been my approach, and it is my training, and I'm going to stick by it. Anyway, that now then leads me back to the question of the conflict in Ukraine. And, well, one could say that it's more of the same. The situation continues to be one of accelerating Russian advance and in Donbass, in fact, in all points in Donbass, and standstill in Kursk. And I'm going to make a number of observations, though, general observations, before I start my discussion of the actual events of the last 24 hours. First one is to comment, to draw attention to an article on Substack written by Glenn Deason, Professor Glenn Deason of Oslo University. As many of you know, Glenn Deason and I know each other very well. We work together and publish interviews with all sorts of important people. I should say that next week we have some very important interviews coming, which have direct bearing on the conflict in Ukraine. I'm not going to discuss those. I'm not going to talk about what those are further. But keep an eye out and you will no doubt find out what they are soon. So Glenn Deason is somebody I know extremely well. And he's written what I think is one of the most insightful articles about the Kursk operation, and one which is absolutely spot on in every respect, and which states the obvious. It's a fact that many articles, many of the best articles are the articles that state the obvious. And I am conscious that someone like myself, sometimes, because I feel the need to go into the weeds, to describe, in some detail, not as great detail as you will find in other places, but in some detail, what is going on the actual front lines. Well, sometimes maybe the statement of the obvious gets blurred a little. But Glenn Deason says it very simply. He says this. He says basically this. He says that this has been an attrition war. The war in Ukraine is an attrition war. It has been an attrition war basically since the negotiations in Istanbul collapsed in April 2022. The Russians have waged against Ukraine an attrition war with deadly effect. So, in an attrition war, the question of who controls what territory and what territorial gains they're making, by definition, is secondary. Obviously, territory matters. It matters a great deal. For example, if over the next few days the Russians capture the towns of Novogrodivka and Selidovo, which I shall talk about shortly. So some territory does matter, some positions do matter, but simply looking at everything in terms of who has been able to capture hundreds of square kilometers of territory is to apply completely the wrong metric. Now, this is something which very often now you see people in the Western media concede. They have gradually come to understand that Ukraine is suffering incredibly severe levels of attrition. And yet, whenever Ukraine does manage to capture some territory, even if, as is the case in Kursk, it's barely inhabited, forest and streams and hilly country interspersed with a few tiny villages. When Ukraine captures this territory, which might cover some hundreds of square kilometers, the entire Western media starts applauding and clapping and cheering. The way Glenn Deason puts it, like a bunch of flapping seals. And I have to say, I think this is absolutely right. I've been reading over the last couple of days in connection with perhaps Ukraine's Independence Day, all sorts of, again, inflated articles, euphoric articles, especially in the European media, and by the way, especially in the British media, which continue to talk about the Ukrainians having turned the tables on the Russians as a result of the Kursk operation in some way. There's even an article, by the way, in the Financial Times, which uses exactly that metaphor, that the Ukrainians have somehow turned the tables on the Russians. There's an even more astonishing article today in the Daily Telegraph by Daniel Hannan, Lord Hannan. He's a member of the House of Lords, but he's also a commentator in the Daily Telegraph. And he appears to think that this operation in Kursk region is the beginning of the end of President Putin, that President Putin's fall is only a matter of time, because the Ukrainians have captured places like Suja and, well, other villages that nobody had ever heard of before in a forested area in Western Russia. That this is somehow, in the middle of a war, going to result in the fall, eventually, of President Putin. This is so far detached from reality. It is so completely wrong that it's astonishing that people still stick with this, even as, on other occasions, they grudgingly admit that there has been an attrition war and that Ukraine is losing it. Well, there we are. It's a fact. There is an attrition war. Ukraine is losing it. In fact, we're now at the point where the attrition is having a demonstrable effect, and we will discuss all of that in a moment. Now, the second point I want to make, again, comes back to the issue of Ukrainian motivations in launching this attack on Kursk. And I've struggled to understand the purpose of this attack. I said that when it became clear that the original objective, the Kursk nuclear power plant, was out of Ukraine's reach, and I think now pretty much everybody accepts that. Continuing with this operation makes very little sense. A Ukrainian officer, as I discussed in my program yesterday, has actually come out and said that this is all now basically all about taking selfies in deserted Russian border villages. What I had perhaps overlooked, and which really only struck me yesterday after I did my program, is that, of course, yesterday was Ukrainian Independence Day. And Zelensky, who has not very much to tell the Ukrainians that would fill them with hope, the Crimean Bridge, for example, is still there. The situation in the energy system in Ukraine is catastrophic. The economy is in a terrible shape and probably getting worse. Inflation and prices are rising fast. Living standards are falling fast. There's all the recruiters seizing people off the streets. There's been pictures of that. Even the Western media has published them. Well, Zelensky, who clearly does want to keep the war going, he needed perhaps, or felt he needed, something to lift the spirits of the Ukrainian people on their Independence Day. So he gave them, or he has persisted rather, with the offensive in Kursk. It's something that gives him some sort of bragging rights, and he's exercised that to the ultimate point. We've seen him do it over the last couple of days to an extraordinary degree. By the way, on that topic, his explanations for the operation are again shifting. He now denies that Ukraine has seized control of territory in Russia as a bargaining chip. He seems to be retreating from the buffer zone idea, though he does come up with it again. But his latest explanation is that it's intended to capture Russian prisoners so that they can be exchanged for Ukrainian soldiers who are in Russian captivity, of whom, by the way, there are far, far more than there are Russian soldiers in Ukrainian captivity. And this, of course, coincides with an exchange of prisoners that did take place yesterday, 115 from each side. Apparently, the exchange was brokered by the United Arab Emirates. Apparently, the 115 soldiers, Russian soldiers, that the Ukrainians returned were mainly or mostly conscripts, the conscripts who were captured by the Ukrainians in Suja on the first couple of days of the Ukrainian offensive in Kursk. So one could perhaps just about see what Zelensky is talking about. But I'm going to say something, which is that it seems to me that overall the Russians actually got the better of this exchange. They got the conscripts back, and that is psychologically and emotionally important in Russia. The Russian government doesn't want the families of the conscripts, the parents of the conscripts doing their national service, to worry that their children might find themselves in a war zone, captured by the Ukrainians, taken prisoner, and that kind of thing. So it's a political need for the Russians to get these young men back, and, well, they've achieved it. But they've conceded relatively little. It seems that Ukraine had been trying to hold out for a return of some more Azov fighters of the 2 Azov brigades, of whom a significant number still remain in Russian captivity. But in the event, the Russians were only prepared to release 1. So amongst the 115 Ukrainian soldiers that the Russians returned to Ukraine, only 1 was an Azov fighter. Anyway, I don't believe that this operation is being conducted by the Ukrainians to capture Russian prisoners. There's been suggestions made on the Russian side of the internet that the Ukrainians were seeking to capture Russian civilians to hold them as hostages, but I have never seen any evidence of that, and I don't want to believe that. And overall, if one has to look at the situation that's playing out on the battlefields in Kursk at the moment, I think it is an indisputable fact that it is the Russians currently who are taking many more Ukrainian prisoners in the fighting in Kursk than the Ukrainians capturing Russians. So, anyway, that is the reality. But, of course, realities don't always play the main role in propaganda. Propaganda is not always founded very much on reality. So, it could be that Zelensky did want to give the Ukrainian people a good story, something to cling on to and hope for on Independence Day. And maybe for that purpose, the Kursk offensive might have served its purpose. However, as we will see shortly, it may be that that purpose won't be served for very long. It won't be there to do that for very long. Now, the Ukrainians have also been trying to use the Kursk offensive to try to get their Western allies to provide them with more weapons and to get their Western allies to agree to allow deep strikes with missiles into Russia. And on the question of more weapons, the Ukrainians are going to get some more weapons, but the fundamental problem is not that the Western powers are unwilling to send further weapons to Ukraine. As Brian Beletic and I have been talking about many, many times, and others as well, it should be said, the problem is that the number, the quantity of weapons in Western arsenals that can continue to be supplied to Ukraine is now very, very run down. Germany apparently is almost exhausted. The attempts to build up shell production in Germany have not been the great success that was being claimed a few months ago. Britain, it's the same. The British have basically stopped sending military supplies in any great quantity to Ukraine, apart from Storm Shadows, which apparently are handmade and are also in relatively short supply. The United States will always be able to send some weapons to Ukraine, but the quantity of weapons that it can send is much diminished from what we saw, say, this time last year. So this is not really an area where the situation can be changed very radically. But of course, getting the Western powers to agree to missile strikes deep inside Russia, well, that is another matter. And here I want to come back to this vexed topic that always comes up, which is the topic of Russian red lines. I've been reading in many places that the use by the Ukrainians of Western tanks and armoured vehicles inside Russia, inside pre-2014 Russia, violates a Russian red line. I cannot remember any point in time when the Russians have ever said that that would be a red line for them. Just saying. It was a Western red line at one time, as I very well remember, back at the start of this conflict. The Western governments, the United States, said that the supply of heavy weapons, tanks, armoured vehicles, that kind of thing, was a Western red line which the West would not cross. The West did not want to get drawn into an endless escalation with the Russians. There was a Western red line. It was never a Russian one. I've discussed in previous programs the constant practice in the West of the West going past its own red lines as it does get drawn into a conflict in Ukraine, which has gone on for much longer, required a much bigger investment of Western resources, and which has failed to achieve the outcomes that the West expected. And when the Western powers cross their own red lines, people in the media, in the Western media, and some commentators and officials in Western governments turn around and say that it's actually the Russian red lines that are being crossed. There is a Russian red line which the West is now very close again to crossing. And that is the use of missiles, ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles to attack facilities inside Russia. And there is a very straightforward reason why the Russians treat this as a red line. And they've explained it. President Putin himself has gone to great lengths to explain why for the Russians that would be a red line. The Russians say, and they're absolutely right about this, that it is impossible for the Ukrainians to launch these missiles, the ATACMS and the Storm Shadows, against targets in Russia without Western military technicians directly participating in the preparation and targeting of these missiles so that they can hit targets inside Russia. And the Russians say that that is a red line because if it happens, it means that Western militaries are directly participating in attacks against Russia itself. This is an issue which the Russians have made clear, providing satellite data, which of course the West does. The Russians accept that that's intelligence information. Providing training, it's not as bad, But when you actually help to launch the rockets that are going to hit, the missiles that are going to hit targets in Russia, that is an act of war conducted by your military against Russia itself and for the Russians. It is therefore a red line. And that is the Russian red line that the Ukrainians are now trying to get the Western powers to cross. One Western government is keen that that red line be crossed, and that is the British government. The previous Conservative government in Britain received a very strong warning from the Russians that it would be a crossing of a red line and that the Russians reserve the right to engage in retaliatory action against Britain and British military targets anywhere in the world. If that happens, the United States has received the same warning. The United States, unlike Britain, seems to be deeply conflicted about this matter. And we're getting reports that the United States has prohibited Britain from using storm shadows against targets in Russia. And we're also getting reports that there are officials in Washington who are saying that not only is this a mistake because it would violate Russian red lines, but it would be pointless because the Ukrainians are trying to justify this by talking about strikes on Russian airfields inside Russia. But the airfields where 90% of the Russian aircraft are based are so deep inside Russia that they are beyond the missiles' reach. Well, we will see how this plays out. But of course, if Zelensky does get this escalation, then I think two things are going to happen. Firstly, it will become immediately obvious that the permission to use Storm Shadows and ATACMS missiles against targets in Russia is not going to have the military effect that many people in the West expect. By now, the Russians are very familiar with these missiles. They have been shooting them down in large numbers. There was an article in Politico which all but accepted that the ATACMS has been a disappointment and that they are in fact now in very, very short supply. So militarily, it is not going to make a difference. In terms of the future, it is going to make a major difference. The Russians will, as they have said, almost certainly start looking for means to pay the Western powers back in kind. So we are likely to see more advanced Russian weapons being supplied to Western enemies around the world with Russian technical support. But beyond that, as I think it was the same article in Politico admitted, or it might have been the Washington Post, the Americans are worried, and this is a fascinating admission, that taking this step would wreck any possibility of a future dialogue being re-established with the Russians, which some American officials understand is necessary. That is a very interesting admission to me, that at some point the United States is going to have to mend its fences with the Russians, and that there are some people in Washington who worry that giving the Ukrainians the permission that they want to launch these strikes into Russia, crossing an actual, genuine Russian red line, is a step too far. Well, at every stage over the course of this conflict, ever since it began, whenever the prospect of escalation has been floated in the West against resistance, initial resistance. The advocates of escalation always win, and no doubt they will do so again this time. But to repeat, this is an incredibly dangerous and very reckless thing, but it is now too little and too late, far too little and far too late to change the rhythm of the battle. And for that reason, I think that the Russians will bide their time and will respond more calculatedly than perhaps they might have done if this red line had been reached just a few months ago. So let us turn now to the actual situation on the front lines. And here I'm going to begin by saying that I have been making a very significant and important mistake in describing the situation in the Pokrovsk area, which I now need to correct and need to correct quickly. Now, if you've been following my updates, you will have noticed that I've been talking about Novogrodivka, which the Russians are now in the process of capturing as a village, and of Selidovo as a town. I have always assumed that Selidovo, which has a population about 10,000, was the bigger place. I was completely wrong. Novogrodivka had a pre-war population of apparently 17,000 people, whereas, of course, Selidovo has had a population of around 10,000. Probably the number of people who are there in either of these two towns is now very much less, but Novogrodivka is certainly not a village. It is a small town, significantly bigger than Selidovo. And it is indeed a Soviet creation, as I'd assumed, created by the Soviets in the 1930s, given its current name, I believe, in the 1960s. And it is obviously a semi-industrial town connected, I suspect, with the coal mining industry. Anyway, the point is, the key thing to understand is that the Russians are now moving very rapidly towards the capture of Novogrodivka. They've captured the villages of Orlivka, Zhuravka, Krutiya, and Krasny Yar immediately to the east of Novogrodivka. They've also captured the village of Mykolaievka, somewhat to the southeast of Novogrodivka. Latest reports say that the Russians have begun the storming and may have even captured the village of Marinivka, which lies immediately to the south of Novogrodivka. And map readings appear to show that the Russians not only control around a third of Novogrodivka itself, but that the Ukrainian defenses, the Ukrainian positions inside Novogrodivka have been cut in two, that the Russians have basically cut Novogrodivka, Ukrainian control, Novogrodivka in half. If Novogrodivka falls over the next couple of days, which is now looking extremely likely, it'll be the fastest capture of a settlement this size that has taken place since the beginning of the special military operation. It looks as if Ukrainian defenses in Novogrodivka are collapsing, and they're collapsing at a speed that we have never seen at any point before in this conflict. And it looks as if the Russians not only are rapidly capturing Novogrodivka, but this morning there were reports that they've captured a village called Kalinova, which lies to the south of Ptychy, which the Russians captured about 2 days ago, that they're in fact now almost reached the village of Mikhailovka, which lies immediately to the east of Selidovo along the M04 and E50 highways, and that in fact the Russians are about to cut this highway and are about to begin an operation against Selidovo as well, attacking Selidovo from the east, from Marinivka and Mikhailovka, and potentially from the south as well, even as the road, this supply road, is cut. So it looks as if the Russians are on the brink of capturing two significant towns in eastern Donbass, with Ukrainian resistance in both places collapsing. And there are further reports from further south still that in Krasnogorovka, this place that has been fought over and discussed by me so many times in so many programs, where the Russians some time ago captured the main positions, it looks as if the Russians are now pushing fast westwards towards various villages, but ultimately towards Kurakovka, which, let me stress, is not the same as Kurakovo. It's another place. But anyway, it looks as if the Russians are preparing to launch another front against the Ukrainians in this area as well. As I said, they've captured Krasnogorovka, and it looks as if they're pushing forward, and that they're pushing forward here very, very fast along the railway lines, ultimately towards Kurakovka as well. And, well, the military summary channel suggested that the Russians are preparing some great encirclement operation of Ukrainian forces that still lie somewhere in the fields north of Krasnogorovka and south of places like Pervomaisky and Itailova, which the Russians captured some time ago. I think that the Russian moves are much more easily explained. Going back to what Glenn Deason said, this is an attrition war. The Russians are stretching the Ukrainian lines. The Ukrainian lines around Pokrovsk and in the Selidovo, Novogrodivka area are collapsing, and the Russians don't want the Ukrainians to create defenses around these places by reassigning troops who might be defending places like Kurakovka and all of these other places. So they're starting an offensive from Krasnogorovka in that direction as well. The Russians have the resources to do this. They now outnumber the Ukrainians right across the front lines. And if I may say, this is consistent with Russian military doctrine, going all the way back to the Brusilov offensive of 1916, which is that you do not attack in one place on a narrow front. On the contrary, you attack right across the front line in every direction, putting enormous pressure on the enemy, causing the enemy to commit his reserves to try to plug holes in the front line. And then it's only when the front line starts to collapse, that's when you start sending in your heavy mechanized forces to exploit whatever breakthrough opportunities then arise. So the Russians will always try to stretch Ukrainian defenses, and that's what they're now doing with these advances westwards from Krasnogorovka, even as Ukrainian positions further north around Selidovo and Novogrodivka begin collapsing. And given the size of Novogrodivka, which I had completely underestimated, we can see why the Russians made its capture a priority. More likely than not, Grodivka itself has now been captured by the Russians. There's film showing the Ukrainian forces who were defending Grodivka. This is the village on the main road to Mirnograd, which the Russians began attacking some days ago, about a week ago. Anyway, there's a film which shows the Ukrainian soldiers who were defending Grodivka fleeing from the village and being bombed and shelled and attacked by the Russians whilst they were doing so. So it's likely that Grodivka has already fallen. But one way or the other, before the main offensive on Pokrovsk itself begins, the Russians would want to have large places like Novogrodivka and Selidovo securely under their control. So, changes the understanding of the battle around Pokrovsk a little. The fact that Novogrodivka turns out to be a fairly big place, but not perhaps ultimately so much. Now, bear in mind what I've been saying about attrition war. If in a few weeks' time Pokrovsk falls, the Russians will have captured on the run in this precise area Krasnogorovka, Selidovo, Novogrodivka, and Pokrovsk. All significant towns. Novogrodivka, by way of comparison, is 3 times the size of Sudzha, the one town that the Ukrainians have perhaps insecurely captured in the Kursk area. Well, this is the most exciting area of the battlefield, the Pokrovsk area, but there's reports of more Russian advances in the Toretsk and Chasov Yar areas as well. From what I can tell, in both places, the Russians are advancing more deeply into the center of both of these towns. And as I discussed in my program yesterday, I think that both towns, both Toretsk and Chasov Yar will be falling fairly quickly. Now, perhaps conveying a sense of the drama that is playing out on the battlefield, yesterday, Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, went and met with his senior commanders. And the Kremlin website has provided us with a very brief readout. It reads as follows. Vladimir Putin held a meeting with the commanders of the Joint Force Grouping at one of the Defense Ministry's command posts and received reports from Chief of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, Valery Gerasimov, and Chief of the Main Operational Directorate of the General Staff, Sergei Rudskoy, on efforts to counter the enemy forces that invaded Kursk region and measures taken to destroy them, as well as on the ongoing results of the special military operation. The President heard over telephone reports of the commanders of groups of forces of the operational situation in the areas of their responsibility. Now, notice a number of things here. First of all, we're not told the precise building where this happened. We're not told, for example, whether it happened in Moscow or in some other place. It's possible that Putin went and held this meeting in Rostov at the command headquarters there. I'm not going to speculate about this. He heard a report from the overall commander, who is Gerasimov, but also from the operations chief of the General Staff, who is General Rudskoy. And this is an important figure, and the fact that the entire leadership, the main leadership of the General Staff, were reporting directly to Putin. Gives us a sense of the drama. Now, the report speaks of Putin hearing reports about the destruction of the Ukrainian force in Kursk. And it does seem as if this most emphatically now is the plan. We'll come to that shortly. On efforts to counter the enemy forces that invaded the Kursk region and measures taken to destroy them. But he was also interested in the ongoing results of the special military operation, and he received reports by phone from the various group of forces commanders, and that seems to have been all of them, and that tells us that Putin was being updated about the progress of the general offensive. So people like Mordvichev and Templinsky and Lapin and others reported directly to Putin about what was going on in their various areas of responsibility. So he wasn't just interested in the situation in Kursk. Most definitely he would have wanted to know, or would have been briefed about what is going on in Pokrovsk, Selidovo, Novogrodivka, what is happening in Toretsk and Chasov Yar, in the area around Siversk, all of those things. Anyway, let's now look at the situation in Kursk region. And, well, I'm going to briefly now, I'm going to read what was being provided to us by Group of Forces North. They have given us their usual daily account of the fighting in the area in Kursk region. And I'll read it, I'll be fairly brief. They say that fierce fighting continues in the village of Malaya Loknia. We are holding back the onslaught of the enemy, numbering over 100 troops, supported by tanks and Western artillery. During the day in the battle, up to 50 Ukrainian troops, a tank and several armoured vehicles were destroyed. In addition, the enemy is attacking settlements at Ruskoye Porechnoye and Nechayev. Our fighters repelled 3 attacks in this direction, destroying up to 30 enemy troops and burning 4 armoured vehicles. Now, all of these places, Malaya Loknia, Nechayev, Ruskoye, Porechnoye, they're all located, they're all villages close to each other, northeast of Suja itself. So there's fighting been going on there, but Group of Forces North tells us that the attacks have been repelled, and that, by the way, is what the Russian Defense Ministry is also saying. The Group of Forces North also say that in the area of Korenovo, we repelled enemy attacks on the settlement of Komarovka with up to 20 fighters and 3 TBMs. I don't know what that means. Enemy losses amounted to 9 troops. No breakthrough was allowed. Komarovka, the Ukrainians have failed in frontal attacks against Korenovo. They've been trying to outflank it from the south by launching attacks towards Komarovka. Repeated attacks, all of which, so far as I can see, fail. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry has provided its own supplement of this information. They provided their own account of what has been happening in the area of Kursk, and they also confirm the attacks on Komarovka, Malaya Loknia, Nechayev, and Cherkaskoye Porechnoye. And they say that all of these attacks by the Ukrainians have been repelled. And they also give their accounts of Ukrainian losses. They say that the Ukrainians over the last day lost 300 men, dead and wounded, 14 armoured vehicles and 1 tank and 1 infantry fighting vehicle. And the total losses of the Ukrainians now, since the start of the offensive, are 5,800 men killed and wounded, 72 tanks and 32 infantry fighting vehicles, 68 armoured personnel carriers and 383 armoured vehicles. So that's what we are being told. But the key point again, and it's a point I've been making several times now, is that the Ukrainians are stuck. All of these places, Malaya Loknia, Ruskoye Porechnoye, Cherkasskoye Porechnoye, and Nechayev, that the Ukrainians attacked over the last 24 hours. As I said, they're located north of Sudzha, northeast of Sudzha, and the Ukrainians have made multiple attacks in that direction, trying to capture these villages, but failing to do so. Now, Group of Forces North have not referred in this latest report, nor has the Russian Defense Ministry, to another village called Ruskaya Konopelka, where there have also been Ukrainian attacks. But I understand that that village is now still very firmly under Russian control. And it looks as if the village of Ulanok in this area is also under Russian control. I'm drawing this information from Russian Defense Ministry and Group of Forces North reports. Many mappers will tell you otherwise, just as many mappers still insist that Snagust and Olgovka are under Ukrainian control, even though Group of Forces North and the Russian Defense Ministry again suggest the opposite. And despite the fact that in the case of Snagust and Olgovka, film has appeared which appears to show Russian soldiers in those villages. Now, the point is, Ruskaya Konopelka is actually located very close to Sudzha itself. I'm guessing that if you were to drive in peacetime from Sudzha to Ruskaya Konopelka by car, you'd probably be able to do the journey in about 10 minutes. I mean, it's very, very close. And all of that strongly suggests to me that with the Russians apparently located in Martinovka, just to the northeast of Sudzha, located also in this village of Ruskaya Konopelka, the Russians are much closer to Sudzha still than is being accepted by some people in some of the mapping projects. And it is likely that Russian claims that there is still a presence of Russian troops in a village which is perhaps one of the suburbs of Sudzha, called Mirnie, that might actually be true. Now, there are reports that the Russians have been gradually moving westwards along villages from a place called Giri, that they've been pushing northwards and westwards towards Sudzha from that direction. I'm starting to think that these Ukrainian attacks on these villages, Malaya Loknia, Cherkasskoye Porechnoye, Ruskaya Porechnoye, Ruskaya Konopelka, that their real purpose is not to increase, to advance further. It is to try to provide a shield of villages to protect Sudzha from a potential Russian counterattack from the north and west. And from the north and east. And if that's correct, then perhaps that Russian counterattack will start to materialize fairly soon. We're getting reports, as I said, that Russian mechanized units are starting to appear in the area, and we might, in that case, over the next couple of days, be seeing a Russian offensive in the Sudzha area. Anyway, Putin had his meeting with his top military people yesterday. We don't know where. He was looking at the whole situation across the battlefronts. I think that he sensed victory, that the Russians are starting to scent victory, sniff victory. It's not there yet. It's not yet in their hands, but things are moving very rapidly now, very rapidly in their direction. And, well, there's probably an awful lot of fighting still to do. But one way or the other, even in the Kursk area, it may be that things are now starting to, the pendulum is now shifting back, and that the Russians might be preparing an attack on Sudzha itself to recapture Sudzha, which would probably cause the collapse of the entire Ukrainian position in Kursk region. I'm going to go back to the point that Glenn Deason made, that this is an attrition war, and the capture of territory is not a metric of success. One should remember that, as well as my other point, that the Russians like to stretch a defense line. This is their method of conducting offenses. Force your opponent to stretch his defense line as far as possible, thinning his forces, causing him to suffer immense casualties, and then breaking through when somewhere along the defense lines things begin to collapse. Not only did Ukraine fail to deal the Russians any sort of knockout blow in Kursk, but by stretching their own defense lines, they assisted the Russians in conducting the war, in the conduct of the war, in the way that the Russians want. I'm going to repeat what I've already said. When the eventual collapse in Ukraine comes, there will be very bitter recriminations about who was responsible for the Kursk operation. Anyway, this is where I finish my program today. Let me remind you once more that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop, links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.